God of Israel to sacrifice burnt offerings in accordance with the law of Moses. Now, underline the fact in chapter 3, verse 2, they rebuilt the altar first. Then they begin to try to rebuild the temple. All of this is going on in about 535 BC. But it's not going to be an easy process. It's going to have some challenges and some difficulties along the way. They give the money in verse 7. They've got to send up to Lebanon, to Sidon and Tyre, to bring cedar logs by sea down the Mediterranean coast to Joppa, as authorized by Cyrus, the king of Persia. They're going to have to, if they build this second temple, get the wood for it, get the stone cut for it. It is going to take time. And by the end of the 3rd chapter, all they've got done is the foundation of the whole thing. And the foundation is laid. And there's a great shout, and the people are excited. Those that had seen the former temple, the old men in the crowd, who'd lived from the time they were kids, who'd seen the first temple, wept as they see this new temple. They weep first of all because they're thrilled that it's going to be built again, finally. They also weep because it really ultimately, initially, doesn't compare to Solomon's temple. They don't have the wealth and the prosperity they had under Solomon to do this. Oh, they have the authority of the Persian Empire. They do, in essence, the best they can. They face opposition in the 4th chapter, and they get slowed down in the process, and pretty soon Cyrus is dead and gone. There are other men on the throne, and they're constantly having to send back to Persia for authorization to finish all of this, to get the job done, and it's 515 BC before they finally finish the temple and get the temple built. The whole emphasis in this period of time focuses on the reoccupation of Jerusalem. They rebuilt the altar. They offered the burnt offerings, they celebrated the Feast of the Tabernacles, and they laid the foundation of the temple during this period of time. And then there was a delay of 16 years. They just didn't get it finished. They run out of money, they run out of enthusiasm, and the empire turns over emperors. And finally, 16 years later, Zerubbabel leads the charge to say, we've got to get it done. Haggai, the prophet, comes along and says, this is a disgrace to God that it isn't finished. We've got to do whatever is necessary to get this temple rebuilt. And Haggai preaches the necessity of the rebuilding of the temple. Zerubbabel organizes the people and leads the effort. And finally the job was done, and the temple was complete and reconstructed and dedicated then unto the Lord. Encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the rebuilding resumed by Zerubbabel. Objections by a local guy named Totney and others who tried to say, you don't have the authority to do this. What do you people think you're doing? You build a temple, the next thing you know, you'll build a wall and you'll build a city and you'll revolt against the Persian Empire. But revolt was not in their heart. All they wanted to do is get back to the way things had been. Get back to being right with God again. Get back to where the temple was the center of their community, where the worship of God was their primary focus. And he gives this wonderful account of everything that went on in this period of time, and he's quoting official documents of Cyrus the Great and Artaxerxes and the various kings of Persia, and the personal letters that went back and forth from the Jews to the Persian emperor, and you begin to get a feel of what is going on culturally during this time. Now, one thing that is not going on is war. The Persians have conquered the whole region. Everything is under their control and their authority. Now, this is not where you have Babylon and Egypt at war with each other and Judah is caught in the middle. All of them are under the Persian Empire now. And in a time of peace and prosperity, there are problems and difficulties, yes, and objections and critics, and people saying, who authorized you to rebuild this temple, etc. It becomes obvious that Cyrus's decree is reaffirmed by Artaxerxes, and it is during the reign of Artaxerxes, the Persian king, that Ezra and Nehemiah now come to Jerusalem to encourage the people to go to the next step. They appeal back to the decree of Cyrus and finish the temple on March the 12th, 515 BC, a date that is still revered by the Jewish people even unto this day. So you have the restoration of the nation, you have the reconstruction of the temple, and now Ezra will focus his attention on the revival of the people, that the people need to get their hearts right with God. We have the reformation of the nation in chapters 7 through 10. That by the royal decree of Artaxerxes, Ezra becomes the head of Jewish affairs in the empire, that he is sent from Babylon with 2,000 men to assist him. And as he returns, they have a national fast. He calls on the people to fast unto the Lord. And calls on them to separate from the Samaritans. And then he renounces intermarriage with the pagans and even tells them to divorce their pagan wives, and you have then the reformation of Judaism itself. In other words, what happens in the book of Ezra takes us from the Babylonian captivity on the one hand to Orthodox Judaism on the other hand. Whatever the religion of the Old Testament was like under the judges and the kings, it never quite held its commitment to the Lord. Idolatry kept creeping in on the edges of Judaism, but not after the captivity. Ezra is determined. No idols, no foreigners, no compromise. We're going to live right, do right, no matter what. We'll stop eating. Everybody start fasting and denying food and denying yourself and repent. And let's read the law of God and let's get right with God. All of that, so well intended, so well meaning, so well used of God. They needed that kind of commitment to come back and to rebuild. But one of the problems that comes out of this period of time is there is such a constant emphasis on the law, the law, the law, the law, the law, that it becomes legalistic after a while. You're in bondage to all these legalistic structures. No, you can't do that. That's work on the Sabbath. No, you can't do that. Jesus, you can't even heal somebody on the Sabbath. That's violating the Sabbath, etc. They become so locked into the book and the structures and the laws that they forget the very heart of God and the very grace of God, and we find the Jews living out these legalistic desires to try to say that if I dress right, act right, behave right, pray right, read right, then I'm right with God. And Jesus will come along in the New Testament and say, but what about hatred and anger and prejudice and bitterness in your heart toward people? What about letting God change your heart? About changing the inside as well as the outside? You're all worried about who washed the cup properly, ceremonially, so that I can properly drink out of it, when you haven't washed your hearts. And bitterness and anger comes out of your hearts, and God needs to cleanse you inside, not just outside. Yes, external cleansing is a symbol of the internal cleansing of the Spirit of God, but you can't just say that because I washed my hands properly, I washed the cup properly, I prepared the food properly, everything is kosher, that it's all right. No, you've got to clean the heart. It's not just circumcision of the body that is important, it's circumcision of the heart that is important. Cut away the sin and the bitterness and the anger in your heart, and learn to love God with all your heart and soul and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Even your Samaritan neighbor in the story of the Good Samaritan. A Samaritan? Are you kidding? That a man, a Jew, went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and was beaten and robbed by thieves and left by the side of the road. And a Jewish priest walked by and said, I'm busy on my way to business. I can't bother with this. I'm on my way to serve God. And then pretty soon a Levite came by and said, I don't have time for this. And finally a Samaritan came by. A Samaritan? You got to be kidding me. Those people that left of the line of David, that turned their back on the temple of God, that fell under the judgment of God in that northern kingdom and later were replaced by a mixed population that were part Jewish and part Arab or part whatever. And this mixed population of people who tried to say they were following the law, but they really weren't. This Samaritan picked the guy up and took him to the hotel and paid the bill. And Jesus turned to the Jewish doctor of the law and said to him, what? Who was neighbor to the one that fell among the thieves? And he was so prejudiced he could not say the Samaritan. He finally said, him that showed kindness. And Jesus said, then go and do thou likewise. Then you go do the same. You see, you got to love your Samaritan neighbor. You got to love your Palestinian neighbor. You got to love your Arab neighbor. You got to love your Jewish neighbor. You got to love your Gentile neighbor. You got to love your black neighbor, your Hispanic neighbor, your white neighbor, your Caucasian neighbor, your Native American Indian neighbor, your or Asian neighbor, whoever, whatever, wherever. God is a God of all people who is willing to give salvation to all who will come unto him. Ezra meant well, and certainly the spiritual changes that occurred were necessary if they were going to hold on to their Jewish identity and their Jewish heritage. The whole emphasis of the book of Ezra is everybody work together, everybody get right with God together, and when it is over, he prides himself that the worship of the Lord has been set back in the right order again, and that we are right with God. The temple has been built. It's been dedicated to the Lord. The people have been reformed, and the law of God shall prevail in this new nation in the generations to come. An incredible transformation took place because one priest got serious about the Lord and the Word of God and the law of God and the things of God and challenged the people of God to do the same. Now, as good as all of that was, there was still one thing missing. They'd gone back to Jerusalem. They'd rebuilt the temple, but they hadn't rebuilt the wall. They were unprotected. In case there were to be a local war of any sort, if anyone were to attack them, they were vulnerable to attack because the wall was not rebuilt. And as we go from the end of Ezra to the story of Nehemiah, a contemporary of Ezra, we see the story then of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. In the book of Nehemiah, the picture of Christ is the builder of Jerusalem, again illustrated by Nehemiah, who with all of his heart and desire and courage puts himself at risk to say to the Persian emperor, we are grateful that Cyrus passed the decree to rebuild the temple and that you've reinforced that and allowed the Jews to finally rebuild their temple, but there's another problem. They've never rebuilt the walls. The gates of the city are burned. The walls are broken down. They're living there unprotected. Let me go back. Let me build the walls of Jerusalem all over again. Look at Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1. Notice how it begins. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Circle Nehemiah's name in verse 1. In the month Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, circle Susa or Shushan in some translations, the same place. While he's there, it's now about 445 BC. We're long beyond the Babylonian captivity, long beyond the return under Zerubbabel. We're getting down to the end of Old Testament history in the 400s. He's serving the Persian emperor in the city of Susa in Elam, down near the border of Iran and Iraq and Kuwait. It's where the king goes to get down near the beach, if you will, near the Persian Gulf. He said, one of my brothers came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned him about the Jewish remnant who had survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. Underline the words remnant and exile in verse 2. I want to know, how are those Jews doing back in Jerusalem? I'm living here in Persia, in the Persian Empire, in the province of Elam, in the city of Susa. I'm the cupbearer to the king, the butler. A very trusted position, by the way. He doesn't want a Babylonian serving his drink to him because he might poison him, so he trusts a Jew to do it. And Nehemiah has risen in the providence of God, which you always see behind the scenes in these books. There are no miracles in these books. In any of these stories, in Ezra, Nehemiah, or Esther, you have human beings trusting God, trying to do the right thing, etc., putting their lives at risk to believe in God, and you see the unseen hand of the providence of God behind the scenes. How are they doing? And he said to me, those who have survived the exile and are back in the province. Judah is now a province, notice, of the Persian Empire. It is not a kingdom any longer. They're in great trouble and in disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates have been burned with fire. Underline the wall of Jerusalem broken down. That's the problem that has to be resolved in the book of Nehemiah. And he says, I wept for several days and I fasted and I prayed. And then you have his prayer. Oh God, remember us, the people of Judah, the people of Jerusalem. I can't bear the thought that they're there and the walls are not rebuilt and they are there unprotected. Here I am serving the cup to the king of Persia every single day, the man who has the power to authorize doing something about all of this. Help me, give me the opportunity to talk to the king. Then look at chapter 2, verse 1. In the month of Nisan, we're using the Jewish calendar here, King Artaxerxes, when the wine was brought